At the ammo can, my buddy is like, hey, Rory, grab the bang off my back. So I was like, sure. As soon as it clears the pouch, the spoon pops in my hand. I have 1.5 seconds to make a decision as to what I'm gonna do with this. He's not wearing hearing or eye pro. I'm not wearing hearing or eye pro. And I have a C2 interior strip with blasting cap and priming system at the base of my kit. The priming system is like right over my balls. So I did what any composed warrior would do. And I was like, fuck. And I threw it behind me where I knew nobody was standing. Boom, boom. My hand looks like a bunch of microwave sausages. My fingers are split open. The tip of my finger is missing. I was just like, what the fuck? Name is Rory Farrell. Served in the US Navy from 2004 to 2024 as a SOIDC, or Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman, also known as a Recon IDC, formerly known as a Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman. I grew up in Colchester, Connecticut. Connecticut's a relatively safe state. Good place to grow up for sure. Pretty boring. Childhood was traumatic for sure. Didn't experience any major childhood traumas. Parents did separate when I was a young teenager. My parents were emotionally absent and just an unloving environment. So there was no overt trauma, but it really wasn't like a happy place. I have 3 older sisters who are a very significant part of my life. I've gone to them for counsel up until I got married. They were my best advocates, and to this day I'm still very close with them. I did watch 9/11. That was obviously very impactful. I think it shaped most people who went into the GWAT. I would look to that as probably the biggest inspiration. Beyond that, I always had a call to service. I knew I wanted to be in the military. 9/11 just kind of pushed me over the edge, and it's like, hey, the time is now. The Navy seemed like a safe bet. I always had an interest in naval special warfare, wanted to pursue something in that, ended up going in a different direction, but I think that was the initial draw to join the Navy. My grandfather served in the Navy in World War II, so I found a little bit of legacy in that. But I knew I didn't want to join the Army, didn't know anything about it. At least the Navy was stationed on the coast, so next to the ocean. Did okay on the ASVAB, well enough to have my pick of what jobs. He came back with 2 options. One was corpsman, which the name in itself, you're just like, what is a corpsman? So he's like, they're medics. If you join right now, you're likely to be a medic with the Marines, and you're going to go to Iraq. And I was like, all right, well, I'm like, what do they do when they get out? And he's like, they just become like nurses and doctors. And, I was like, okay. And then he's like, this other option, which he was clearly pushing, was storekeeper. And I was like, what's a storekeeper? And he's like, oh man, he's like, these are the guys that stock the ships with all their food, and like, you'll run the store on the boat. And I was like, okay. I was like, what do they do when they get out? And he's like, man, you can manage a grocery store. And I was like, okay. I was like, I'm gonna go with corpsman. So could not have been a better fit. Not really knowing anything about medicine pre-military, I didn't know if it was gonna be interesting. I didn't know if I was gonna be good at it. I don't know if I'm good at it now, but I've certainly enjoyed it. Yeah, boot camp's really uneventful in the Navy. No significant stories. I think everybody goes through significant changes for sure. For a lot of us, it was the first time being alone. Navy boot camp is a mixture of just like cleaning and folding laundry. Yeah, I went to Corps School in Great Lakes. That was one of the best times I've had in the military. Didn't know how good it was until I progressed. But Corps School was fast and loose back in the day. I mean, like, kids having sex in the garbage cans, out behind the building, tons of underage drinking. Parcheesi's was right down the road on the base, and everybody would go there to like drink and bowl and party. I remember, so you go Corps School to, at the time it was called Field Medical Training Battalion. So it was basically a corpsman's introduction to Marine Corps policies, how to wear the uniform, how to not piss off Marines when you go to your unit, which corpsmen inevitably do. I remember one of the instructors was like, because I was always fucking around. He's like, Farrell, you better take this shit seriously. You're gonna be in Iraq in 6 months. And I was like, I'm going to a hospital, man. So end up getting orders to a hospital, but ended up immediately being augmented to 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Checked in and, I was the greenest corpsman, had no idea what I was walking into, and walked into the company office, and I think it was Echo Company, and these dudes had gone to the initial invasion of Iraq as like PFCs and Lance Corporals, came back, 6-month turnaround, went to Afghanistan, and then I was jumping on with them to go on a MEU, which ultimately went straight to the Middle East. But I remember distinctly checking in and walked in, I was like, hey guys, I'm your new corpsman, H.A. Farrell, so I'm an E2. And they're like, you're probably gonna die like the last one. And I was like, I'm so fucked. And these guys, like E2s, E3s, E4s, with multiple combat action ribbons already. And I mean, I was in over my head for sure. Very steep learning curve. That deployment was uneventful, although it was a combat deployment, relatively uneventful. And then honestly, the following 8 years was relatively uneventful. Couple deployments, did a quick one to Japan for a couple months, then went to Central and South America to do some humanitarian work in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Peru. Really great experience. And after that, went into the Recon pipeline. The Recon Corpsman pipeline, or SOIDC pipeline, requires the same SEAL standards that you'd have going into like BUDS or any NSW program. So SEAL requirements to enter the Recon pipeline, I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but it's basically like swim fast, you better be doing 20 pull-ups, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, and then run fast. So then you get into the pipeline. The pipeline begins with, so after core school, FMTB, the next progression is the basic reconnaissance course, which is a little over 3 months in length, and you go from 0 to hero in terms of planning long-range reconnaissance, amphibious reconnaissance, small boat activities. Relatively high attrition rate for selection courses. You're looking at 50 to 70%. For corpsmen, it's consistently probably 60% or higher. Water evolutions and pool evolutions crush people. And it's brutal. I mean, there's no way around it. So one significant event, we were doing rescues. So this is basically a condensed McQuist course in the reconnaissance course. And before we do any more amphibious reconnaissance training, they have to make sure you can rescue your buddy in full kit and whatnot. So there was one particular instructor, we'll just call him Coach. He was a sergeant at the time, and he was just known for being ruthless. So we're at the pool in I think Pulgus on Pendleton, and it's like 6 in the morning, and we're doing rescues, like graded rescues. So today's like pass, you stay, fail, you go home. And there's this like ominous fog on the pool, and I was in my head, I was like, man, I'm good as long as I don't get Crozier. And so sure enough, the fog breaks just in time for me to see Crozier's face as the guy that I'm gonna be rescuing. And I was like, motherfucker. So one of the captains goes first. He's right in front of me. And this dude was a stud. Goes, comes back through the fog, and he's bleeding from his forehead and his nose. And I'm like, Jesus Christ. So anyway, long story short, ended up rescuing him despite his best efforts to drown me, like legitimately try and murder me in the pool. Rescued past that day. Land nav is pretty intense. You're going on probably 3 or 4 days with no sleep, and you're traveling distances of you're probably running about a marathon in the mountains of Pendleton, trying to find these points day and night. And that was particularly challenging. And once I got over the land nav hump, I felt that I was home free. I was like, yes, I'm gonna crush this. I was having these conversations in my head that I recall that I'm like, what the fuck was I talking about? Like I lost my map. My map slipped out with all my points on it, and I had to backtrack. And I mean, that took like an hour of an already condensed timeline. So I was like, saying these weird things in my head. And I was like, just turn on the fucking lights. Ultimately, then I found my map and then just finished the night. But I would say the most challenging part of BRC is a culmination event where you're basically, it's like patrol week. So you do 3 back-to-back patrols that are 72 hours in length. The positions in the team vary. So like I was assistant team leader, and then radio guy. For those 3 72-hour patrols, you are living in a little area and you're not sleeping. The only sleep you're getting is in the hide site on patrol, which is probably 2 hours. There's a looming instructor and you never know when they're gonna drop in and be like, oh, you were sleeping in the hide site, you fail, or I just killed you. Or legitimately throw a smoke grenade or CS grenade into your hide site because your team was sleeping and now you've gotta get out of there because you're compromised. There's no sleep. And I mean, it's not just mindless droning on. Throughout this period of no sleep, you're doing deliberate mission planning, you're building terrain models, you're briefing your patrol plan to the instructors, all of which is graded. And it's a pretty high stress environment. Probably the first sense of actual accomplishment I felt in the military because it was so hard. And I was looking at the guys I was graduating with and they were just studs. I could talk all day about Recon Marines, and I probably will in a bit, but they are truly silent professionals. And to be able to graduate and call myself a reconnaissance man, or recondo was pretty awesome. So for us at the time, I graduated BRC and then I went straight to the Marine Combatant Dive course in Panama City. I would describe it overall as a gentleman's course. There's not this like overt stress of like yelling instructors and everything. The curriculum is hard enough as it is. It doesn't need instructors beating you down and saying like, oh, you're gonna fucking quit or any of this shit. You're probably gonna fail pool hit. You might fail a pre-dive test. You might have trite in one form or another, but it was a really great course. I went there with having graduated BRC. I had like a 4-minute breath hold. So going into pool hits was pretty easy. Pool hits is always fun. You know, you're on your hands and knees crawling in the 12-foot section of the pool. You're face down, and you know you're gonna get wrecked by an instructor. And you just see these shadows. And if you lose your dive tanks, you fail the hit. So the immediate response, you see like a shadow or the water shimmer and you're like, hold your breath. And then the instructor would like come down and like tap you on the goggles and be like, you know, telling you to like keep moving. But you're face down, the textbook move was they'd come up from behind you and they would basically just go like this and they'll simultaneously rip your mask off and then take away your breathing apparatus basically. And then they'll continue to thrash you for about 45 seconds with the intent of trying to steal your tanks. And after they're done trying to kill you, you can compose yourself, and now you have to basically go through a very systematic approach of trying to recover your scuba tanks. You can YouTube these videos. It's fun to watch for sure. Prior to pool hits, I was like, holy shit, how do people do this? But now I look back at those and I look back fondly on that experience. It was fun. It was really fun. But having a really long breath hold, I had a really great advantage because I could just sit down there and not be bothered by, you know, getting messed around with. So unique to SOIDCs / Recon IDCs, after you graduate the Marine Combatant Dive School, you go to the Navy's Dive Medical course. That's another 5 weeks long. Same place, Panama City. So Navy dive med techs go through this course and also Recon corpsmen. So the whole purpose of that training is to help you recognize a dive injury and determine if somebody needs to go into a recompression chamber. And a recompression chamber is one of those big metal tubes. You might see them on movies where you would put a dive casualty in the chamber and then you pressurize them to simulate a certain depth in the water, and that is the number one treatment for acute dive injuries. Cool course. That was 5 weeks, and then you graduate and you go to SOCM. And SOCM is probably among the hardest schools that you can go to in the entire DoD. It's 10 months long, and
What's SOCM stand for?
SOCM is the Special Operations Combat Medic Course. So it's a SOCOM credentialed Special Operations Medic course on Fort Bragg, or Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg. And this is where Ranger medics go, SEALs used to go, SWCC used to go, Army Special Forces, Civil Affairs, and then Recon Corpsman. A lot of stories about SOCM. I will say that any medic coming out of that program is the best medic in the world. You are definitely the most highly trained from SOCM in terms of point of injury care, meaning you watch somebody get shot or, blown up, and you're the first one on the scene. There is nobody in the world that is better to treat that person than a SOCM graduate. Really impressive. Most certainly the highest stress level that I've experienced in the entire military. More stressful than treating a real world casualty, which I think is like the intent behind the training. I think in the 10 months that you're there, there's like 150 written tests, and then there's like 120 practical, maybe more, practical hands-on assessments. And if you fail really any one of those, you're on the chopping block. You'll go to an academic review board, you'll have to plead your case, they'll look at your academic history, and if you're one of those guys, you have to get a 75 to pass every exam or assessment. And if you're one of those guys getting 75, 76s, they'll likely just send you home. And they're like, hey, you're not the guy we want, or the woman we want. So there's a phased approach. You go from like an EMT level, and then by the time you graduate, you are in different places in the country doing rotations, where they are experiencing real world traumas every day. So for instance, I went to Tampa General, and you're in the ER working as, between a nurse and a doctor. You're normally like right on the doctor's shoulder. And whatever they'll let you do, you do. Varied experiences. Some locations have more trauma in a broader scope. Other locations, you're competing with like residents or other doctors to get procedures because they need to get signed off on stuff. But when you graduate, you have done just a massive amount of training. You have done paramedic rotations and you've done surgical rotations in typically a high-level trauma center in the US. There are certain training modals at SOCM that are employed that are not typically disclosed, and they should remain undisclosed to maintain the integrity of that training. But all I'll say is that what the training method that they employ at SOCM is world-class, and it produces the best medics in the world. So Recon IDCs and SF medic candidates will continue training and go to the Special Forces Medical Sergeant course. That's another 3 months long. That course, you focus on surgery, anesthesia, animal husbandry, and that's typically based on the mission profile that we're gonna go and pursue. So we go into these austere environments, and typically those countries rely on agricultural means to survive, so the animal husbandry is a huge part of that. After SFMS, you would go to airborne, and then you would likely check into your unit. So in total, the Recon IDC pipeline is 106 weeks, about 26 months, which is the longest of any Special Forces medic in the entire DoD. The 18 Deltas is maybe 2 weeks shorter, but Recon IDCs are kind of like, we float around. There's not many of us in the Navy. There's around 200 of us. So most people don't run into us. And then when you do, the question is typically you run into like another corpsman, another senior chief, and they look at you, they look at your Navy rank, and they look at the jump dive and they're like, what are you? You know? And it's disappointing because you've gone through so much training to get to that point, and you're like, we're both corpsmen and you have no idea what we do, you know? So that's really frustrating. After I graduated the pipeline, I did not go SOCM to SFMS. I went SOCM, checked into a unit, which was very typical. Normally there was a probationary period where you would go as a SOCM, you'd be assessed by your senior enlisted leaders and the SMEs to say, yeah, you qualify to go to SFMS. Now everybody goes straight through. I checked into First Recon as a SARC, so I had not completed SFMS yet, and checked in and immediately was put into like a leadership position under, at the time, was somebody I considered a friend, but later turned out to be the single most malicious person that I've ever encountered in the military. So I checked into First Recon, immediately took on what's called a leading petty officer billet for the battalion. You're displaced from the teams and the companies, and you're doing administration. You're doing maybe going to a couple command level meetings. Not glamorous stuff, and certainly was not what I expected having just graduated the pipeline. So I checked in, and the chief above me, who was this guy that I thought was a friend, was just a total absentee. Like, he was just gone most of the time. For reasons unbeknownst to me, he would show up maybe twice a week, would barely put on a uniform. When he did put on a uniform, it was like his blouse and then shorts and flip-flops. So anybody that came in, it would appear that he was like in uniform when he wasn't. And it pissed me off, obviously, because I'm there grinding. And so the point where I think my entire military future changed was after this chief, who is going to remain nameless, went to one of my junior SARC's rooms, his barracks rooms. This junior SARC had just returned from like a 4-day patrol, so he's in his room, he's having a shower beer, and he's got the next 2 days off. And it's like a Tuesday. This chief goes into his barracks room, he's drinking beer from his refrigerator, sitting down, and he's telling this relatively new SARC to the fleet how he would use his controlled substances on deployment. So as a Recon corpsman, we are given the privilege and the opportunity to carry narcotics for treating polytraumas, for treating severe injuries. And so this chief, who's the highest ranking guy, the highest ranking Recon medic at battalion, is telling this new guy how he would use his controlled substances on deployment. This young SARC, who's now a chief, reputable guy, came to me and he's like, Rory, he's like, so-and-so was just in my barracks room telling me how he was using these controlled substances on his deployment. And I immediately got flash rage. And I was like, motherfucker. So I was like, hey, this is a me problem, not a you problem. I will take care of it. So retrospectively, I should have handled this differently. And I was naive to think that I could have handled it. Probably a little bit of ego. But I go into his office, and this is almost immediately after. This is maybe like the next day. And I go into his office, close the door, and I'm like, don't ever let me fucking catch you saying this shit to another corpsman again. And I was like, this is the last time you're ever gonna share that story or those stories. And he obviously did not like that direct approach. And he's like, do we have a fucking problem? And I was like, we have a big fucking problem. And I kept it at that. What I should have done was probably elevate it to a higher level. And I look back and it's like, man, if I could have a do-over, if I could have one do-over, that would be it. The mentality then was like, I'm not a fucking snitch, you know? And I really thought that I handled it, not well, but I thought I handled it. So after that, that chief put a very deliberate target on my back. And the full scope of events that took place over several years, one, I'm still dealing with, but two, likely was the reason why I did not promote. So retiring as an E6 burns me so bad because I was a top performer everywhere I went. And looking back and tracking backwards where it's like, where did things get derailed for my career? And it's at this point. So I checked into first recon. I'm going through these leadership development challenges with this chief, and I go to SFMS. So now I'm displaced from the command and I am on what was then Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty. And he's calling the instructors there, trying to get my BAH turned off because I'm supposed to be in the barracks at Bragg, but I'm staying with a friend in order to maintain BAH. And the instructor,
which is
BAH is just the basic housing allowance, which for California is like $3,000 a month at the time. So this guy's, and I'm like, what is he doing? Like, why is he making those phone calls? Didn't understand it. Later on in that course, I'm supposed to take the chief's exam, which is a written exam required in order to promote to E7 in the Navy. So there is an option to take the late exam, which is months later, which obviously would have been the right fit. This chief is calling the instructors, telling them that, hey, I'm going to order the exam for Farrell and he's going to take it there. And they're like, no, he's going to be on rotation, surgical rotation somewhere, and we don't know where yet. So if you order the exam, he's going to be a no-show. And if he's a no-show, regardless of the reasons why, the Navy just sees you no-showed this exam. And that's it. And that is, in and of itself, could be a career killer or a promotion killer for the next couple of years. That's what ended up happening. I did not even realize that until a couple of years ago that exam was invalidated, which completely took me off the list as somebody that could have been looked at or considered for promotion. So those two things happened and I'm like, damn, like that's kind of fucked up. And I'm starting to notice the trend. So I return from SFMS and I go into a shooting package, which is essentially a 12-week intense point of instruction where you are just learning how to safely manipulate your weapon in a CQB environment, and then you rapidly progress to clearing entire structures at a very quick pace. You're carrying explosives, so C2, deck cord, you're building your explosives, you're running through the house, you're throwing bangs, very intense course. So I'm gonna pause the malicious attacks because this period of time is pretty significant. So I'm in the shooting package. The package is going well for me. However, massive attrition. We started with 48 Recondos who are highly trained, and we lost 17 of them simply for not maintaining the standard or safety issues, or the instructors felt that they were not where they needed to be. So about halfway through this training package, I would show up at 6, I would do my dry runs, rehearsals, make sure my weapon was good to go for the day. So my mornings would start around 06. And on this particular Friday, we were closing up shop early and we're downloading for the day. So we're taking off all of our explosives, we're putting them in the ammo cans. And as I am approaching the ammo can with one of my flashbangs from my pistol belt, at the ammo can, my buddy is like, hey, Rory, grab the bang off my back. So I was like, sure. So as I'm removing this flashbang from his pouch, as soon as it clears the pouch, the spoon pops in my hand. The spoon is what tells you this is live. This is now a live munition. The fuse on a flashbang is 1.5 seconds. And I'm like reliving this as I'm speaking it. So there's like pauses in there as I recall it. The spoon pops in my hand. I have 1.5 seconds to make a decision as to what I'm gonna do with this. He's not wearing hearing or eye pro. I'm not wearing hearing or eye pro. And I have a C2 interior strip with blasting cap and priming system at the base of my kit. The priming system is like right over my balls and my dick. So in 1.5 seconds, all of this flashes before my eyes. So I did what any composed warrior would do. And I was like, fuck. And I threw it behind me where I knew nobody was standing. Boom, boom. And I'm looking at my hand and I'm like, what the fuck? And my hand looks like a bunch of microwave sausages. My fingers are split open. The tip of my finger is missing. And I was just like, what the fuck? Didn't know what happened. The flashbang that was set off sympathetically detonated the one in my hand. And when there was 2 investigations done, one was done by range control, the other was done by headquarters Marine Corps, both yielded, you're not at fault, this was a freak accident, but this entire flashbang was intact, essentially. The pin and the spoon were still intact, although blown off. That's what took off my finger. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, motherfucker. My buddy, who's another special operations medic, comes over, puts a tourniquet on. We get nice and dressed up. And we call range control. We let them know. And then we call the hospital, Naval Medical Center, or Naval Hospital, Camp Pendleton. And we just let them know, hey, we just had a guy with an explosive go off in his hand. We're on our way to see you. He's stable. So I've got a really nice clean dressing on. I've got some blood on me. I probably don't look like I'm in terrible shape. So we check in and I'm like leaning on the counter with my nice clean dressing. And my buddy's like, hey, we called ahead. And it's Friday afternoon in the ER. There's nobody there. And my buddy's like, hey, we called ahead. He had an explosive go off in his hand. And they're like, you had an explosive go off in your hand? And I was like, yep. And they're like, okay, go have a seat over there. So I sit down in the empty ER waiting room and I'm like, it was kind of fucked up. Like I thought this was a little more urgent. So we're sitting there for like 10 minutes and I tell my buddy, I'm like, dude, my hand is killing me right now. Like it's throbbing super bad. And I'm like, hey, this is just like not going well. And he's like, yeah, this is bullshit. So he walks up to the counter and he's like, hey, he had a fucking explosive go off in his hand. And they're like, yeah, we know. We're just waiting for the rest of the role players. And I was like, role players? And he's like, what? And he's like, no, he had a real explosive go off in his hand. And they were like, a real explosive? So they immediately brought me back into the ER and they were just like very apologetic. They looked at my hand and they were like, oh my God. So had a minor surgery that day. That was a Friday. I go back to the shooting package on Monday, which the instructors were like, hey, you're not at fault. We want you back if you want to come back. So checked back in, did some, reconfigured my cast, basically removed it. I put 3 finger splints on and I've got pictures of this because I thought it was so funny at the time, but that gave me just enough dexterity in my thumb and my pinky to operate my pec so I could still do house runs and stabilize the end of my gun and, flip on my pec whenever I needed. So that was Monday I returned to the shooting package. I had surgery Wednesday and then I returned Thursday to the shooting package and ended up graduating the package. Now, at the time, somewhere in between there, I had gotten what's called a 6105 for wearing a ball cap and frogs. So a 6105 is the Marine Corps' version of like a page 13. It's essentially a written disciplinary action for me doing this thing. So the infraction was wearing a ball cap in my frogs while sitting in my Jeep, walking around like the little PX area. Frogs are like a flame-resistant MARPAT uniform, and it's what we wore for the entire shooting package. And I get this 6105. This is in the middle of the package, and it's right after my hand injury. And so up to this point, several years in the military, over a decade in the military, I had never been counseled in my entire career. I had never even been late for a formation. And I'm getting a 6105, which was a big deal. And the reason this is a key part of the story is because this piece of paper will come back to be used against me down the road. So in there, this company commander is like the same thing that led to your hand injury is the same reason why, you're wearing a ball cap in frogs, and essentially like you're a piece of shit. And I was like, wow, like I have never even been counseled for anything. And now this is happening. And I've always just been a do-gooder, I've never really flexed the rules. I'm just like a decent guy in the military. So anyway, graduate the shooting package. The company commander that gave me that counseling also was trying to pull me from that package. And the instructors were like, no way, he is staying. So finished the shooting package. So hand injury, still recovering. I finished the shooting package. put in for a couple days of leave, and I'm going to shoot up to Yosemite. So as I'm walking into the BAS that day with a Talon litter in my med bag, I'm like, I should probably keep my med bag in my Jeep because I'm going to Yosemite. I left the day earlier than I was supposed to. Figured why not get an extra day in the park. What I did not realize was that it was the busiest day in the park. It was Labor Day weekend. There's like 50,000 people in the valley. I didn't know that. I had no plan, no itinerary, no wilderness permits. I was just shooting from the hip. And I was like, oh, I'll go to Yosemite. Can't be that busy. So enter the park, realize, holy shit, this place is packed. I'm gonna get out of the valley. So I leave the valley, I do 2 loops, I leave the valley, and I'm heading north in the park as if I'm gonna exit and go to San Francisco. And for some reason, about 40 minutes into that trip, I backtrack. I turned into a camp, it was Camp White Wolf. I turn around and I'm back at the road I was just going north on towards San Francisco. And I end up turning south towards the valley. And there's only one road. There's not, you can't do much deviation. It's like you're either going to the valley or you're leaving the park. So as I make this turn to backtrack, I remember saying to myself, like, Rory, why are you going this way? Like, there's nothing for you back there. And about 15 minutes into that, a high Sierra storm rolls in, a lot of wind, some rain. There's, bushes being blown across the road, pretty significant wind. And as I'm coming around a corner, I come around the corner just in time to see this 110-foot tall pine tree fall and crush this car right in front of me. I'm literally the next car. There's nothing between me and this car. This happens about 50 meters in front of me. I get out of the car and I'm approaching the vehicle and I'm looking at the extent of the damage to the car. And this tree went down the long axis, just split it right down the middle. And I'm looking at the damage to this car and I'm like, there's no way somebody's in this car. And as I'm approaching, kind of assessing the scene, like making sure nothing else is happening, the father and the daughter speaking in Spanish, like yelling frantically at the car. And based on their reaction, I was like, somebody's still in the car. I know where I am in the park. I know it's gonna take an ambulance at least 10, 15 minutes to get to me. You can't land a helicopter anywhere near here. So, and I'm making these assessments as I'm approaching the vehicle. Once I get there, I look in the front driver's side and I see the woman unconscious, unresponsive in the center console. So she is like this, not breathing, not responding to any verbal cues. And then I look in the back and I see a 4-year-old boy crushed into his booster seat. And so his right temple was on the outside of his left knee. The roof was flat up against his back and the tree was flat up against the roof. And I knew just upon initial assessment that was gonna take a couple minutes to deal with. The mother was not pinned. So I felt that I had the best chance to assess her first, get her out quickly, and then I could take time to get the boy out. So I entered the rear window of the car and I'm assessing the mom, manually adjust her airway, send a rescue breath, and she starts breathing again. I don't think, looking back on it, I don't think that the rescue breath saved her life. I think it was more along like the airway manipulation. So she started breathing, wasn't responsive, but she was breathing. So I was like, hey, bystanders, get her out and put her on the side of the road. Be careful of her head and neck. Then I turned my attention to the little boy and I'm like looking down, I'm like bending over as far as I can to see his face. And he's got a lot of facial trauma. His left arm, he had a distal humeral head fracture. So his arm was kind of bent unnaturally. And the point of those assessments is that I couldn't pull on him without doing greater harm. So I'm talking to the bystanders and I'm like, hey, we need to lift this tree up so I can lift the roof off so I can get him out. So a bunch of bystanders are out there and I count down from 3. They lift up the tree and then I like position myself by him and I squat the roof off his back, maybe a couple inches, but it was enough to move him without grossly manipulating him. And he literally just melts into my arms. Tons of facial trauma. First thing I do, he's got a really good radial and carotid pulse, which is a great sign. So basically he's in my arms and I'm curling him like this, taking his pulses. They're equal in rate and rhythm, which is great. He's alive and he is clearly fighting for his life. And having a son now changes how I recall the event, because I could just imagine being the father standing there helpless, like my family's gonna die. So I'm in the back of the car. I take his radial and carotid. He's got a great pulse. He's not breathing. And the tree is now back on the car, crushing the compartment. And I send a rescue breath, no response. So now the passenger compartment is getting pretty condensed. Hand him out the window. I get out of the car, I take him back, and now I am like keyed in on his airway. He is gonna die of respiratory failure if I do not get him breathing. So we're on the side of the road, and what I learned after the fact was that he had basically a brain bleed. He had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and it was putting pressure on his brain, which was locking his jaw. So I was fighting that. So I end up getting it open. I look in, it's completely occluded with blood and vomit. So roll him, scoop everything out, give him another rescue breath, and he arches his back and takes a breath like a newborn baby, like lets out this like crying scream. And I was like, oh, he's gonna be okay. So there was a long way to go, but he was breathing and he wasn't gonna die right now. So as he is beginning to start breathing, I hear somebody on the phone with dispatch and they're like, oh, I think the little boy's dead. So I'm like, hey, give me the phone. So I take the phone and I'm like continuing to assess the little boy while I'm talking to dispatch. I relay patient disposition for both patients. And I ended with, I do not recommend ground transport. You're gonna need 2 helicopters. The only thing they asked was, who are you? And I was like, I'm a special operations medic. Surprisingly, they listened to me and they spun up 2 helicopters. One was from Modesto Children's Hospital, which was en route almost immediately. So at some point in the assessment, I'm like looking at the mom and I'm like, man, I would kill for a BVM, which is a bag valve mask to assist with respirations, in a C collar, which is like the thing you put around the neck to stabilize it. And I was like, damn, I would kill for a BVM and a C collar. And I was like, holy shit, I have my med bag. So I ran up, grabbed my med bag, came back, put the C collar on her, gave a bystander instructions as to how to bag. And then I turned my attention to the little boy. Just as I'm wrapping up that, one of the paramedics arrives in the ambulance and they're like, immediately come up to me and they're like, hey, were you the guy on the phone with dispatch? And I was like, yep. And they're like, who needs to go? And I was like, little boy needs to go right now. And they're like, will you come with us? So I was like, yeah. So I forgot, very early on before the paramedics arrived, a ranger came running up to me, a park ranger, and he comes running up. He's like, hey, who the fuck are you? And I was like, special operations medic. And he's like, okay, all right. I'm gonna go set up some cones. So the look of relief on his face that there was somebody with decent training there to like help the situation, he was like, okay, I'm gonna go set up some cones. So he goes and does that, paramedics arrive. Fast forward, we are putting the little boy in the back of the ambulance and we are making our way up. The bird is en route from Modesto Children's Hospital. The ETA is like a couple minutes. So we're leaving, and this isn't meant to sound disparaging. It's just a part of the story, but the EMT is at the head bagging and she's like, oh my God, we forgot our bags at the scene. And I was like, no problem. I was like, I have mine, we can use mine. So we use a couple items from my bag, put it back on. We get to the helo landing zone. The bird from Modesto Children's Hospital is arriving almost right on time. We do a turnover with them, and everybody's kind of like high-fiving, and the little boy is going to be under bright lights in cold steel and in surgery in like 20 minutes. Overall, very successful. So we're all high-fiving, and I take off my gloves, and this was very recently after my hand injury. And they were just like, what the fuck happened to your hand? And I was like, I had a type of explosive go off in it, and I was like, it's not as cool as you think it is. And they were just like, who are you? You know? And that whole time, I essentially did all of that with one hand. You know, I've got a couple bum fingers, and it was just too painful, so I was like, I could just do this with one hand. So I did most of it with one hand. I don't say that to be boastful. It was just very shortly after the injury, and my hand was hurting quite a bit. So after that, you know, I was treated really well in Yosemite. Ended up spending the next 4 or 5 days in the park. You know, I went into the woods, did Half Dome, and just really wanted to collect my thoughts. That was the original purpose of the trip. I was like, let me just go into the woods and kind of collect my thoughts in the wake of this hand injury and this like random counseling I received. Did the heroic stuff in Yosemite, and the chief ranger of Yosemite sent a letter to my command basically saying like, we're gonna put this guy in for the highest award that the Department of Interior has. We would expect you to do the same for the DoD. So bringing it full circle, this chief at the time is like, oh man, we got to write an award for you. And so initially the medical officer writes up a comm, lazily written comm, goes up. The award recommendations were like, no, this doesn't need to be a comm, this needs to be a Navy Marine Corps medal, which is a much higher award. So this chief goes to an awards meeting, and they're like, hey, cancel the comm. We want to put him in for a Navy Marine Corps medal. He comes down from that meeting, and I'll never forget this, comes down from that meeting, and in the BAS, or like our medical building, there's like 20 of us having like a little meeting, comes down and looks at me and says, he's like, hey, they want me to put you in for the Navy Marine Corps medal, but that's going to require 2 notarized witness statements. And he's like, no offense, I just don't feel like doing that. And I was like, roger that. I was like, okay. I can't write the award myself. So nothing came of that. You know, there's a comm floating around somewhere, but he took very deliberate steps to sabotage that process. While I was deployed, so my next deployment overall was a good deployment. It was a MU, but I did a lot of good work as a medic, which I'll talk about in a minute. But while I'm deployed, he calls my detailer, which is the equivalent of a monitor in the Marine Corps. It's essentially the person responsible for giving you orders to your next duty station. So he calls my detailer while I'm deployed. I can't contact them on my behalf. I'm really can't contact anybody. And he has my orders changed from 2nd Raider Battalion, which is, there was a verbal agreement with my detailer that that's where I was gonna go, and changes it to Okinawa, Japan, 3rd Recon Battalion. I get told as I'm walking into the BAS in the morning time on my deployment, some E3 is like, he's like, you got orders to Okinawa. And I was like, who the fuck are you? And how do you know I've got orders somewhere? And why don't I know this? And so go through the confirmation process, and sure enough, I had orders confirmed to 3rd Recon Battalion, completely unbeknownst to me. This was earth-shattering for me. And it wasn't because it was Okinawa, it wasn't because it was 3rd Recon, it was because I had mentally committed to going to this elite level unit. And also, more importantly, going through the immigration process with my wife, who is, you know, to this day, we're still working that out because of these orders to Japan. So completely derailed all of that. You know, like, was my wife gonna be able to come with me? How does she even feel about going to this remote place, this remote island in another country? And so he called my detailer and was like, yeah, change his orders, he actually wants to go here. I find out on deployment, and it put me in a really difficult position because a lot of the guys who get orders to 3rd Recon will try and get out of it somehow. It was not a glamorous place to be. It is now, and they're absolutely at the forefront of the next conflict, and they're doing amazing work. But before, it was just this image of like, oh man, I don't want to go to Japan, 2 or 3 year orders. So I was in a position to where I would look like a coward if I did something to get out of those orders, and I wasn't going to do that. So end up accepting the orders, and despite, a couple conversations, and they're like, hey, there's no going back. In the process of doing that, he called the senior enlisted leader of 2nd Raider Battalion and was like, hey, Rory's not the guy you want. He's immature, he needs to grow more, which I don't think is a fair characterization of me or my work ethic or experience in the military. So I was like, what the fuck? Didn't find this out until after the fact. And that senior enlisted leader, who was a master chief, who should have known better, was like, oh, roger that, send him to Oki. Basically put him in a closet. And I was like, wow, So it doesn't end there with the maliciousness. He ends up, that document, that 6105, while I'm deployed, he takes that document and tries to have it uploaded into my official military record after he basically photoshopped it. He photoshopped it from the Marine Corps paperwork onto the Navy paperwork, forged my signature on the Navy document, and then tried to upload it into my official military record as a command level NJP. He did this on his last day in the military right before midnight. And I have screenshots of this official transaction that another chief sent me. And I'm like, this is like psychotic. This is like properly psychotic. And so that experience in the collective efforts likely led to poor fit reps and not promoting, not to mention the reputational damage as well, which I just felt was like completely unfair. When I confronted him about the drug use, I think that is what completely shifted his mindset. And he's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to like fuck this guy over, without a doubt. That's the only thing. I was a reliable person in his life. I was a stabilizing factor for that guy. And then, several malicious attempts after that. So disappointing nonetheless. And I really wasn't able to regain control of my career, especially being in Japan at the time. My leadership heard me out and they were like, hey, we believe you. I was deployed with these guys, did a pre-workup or pre-deployment workup with them. They knew my work ethic and they knew who I was, and they were like, what? They were almost like, no, dude, this can't be happening. So there were conversations that took place about legal action, but at the end of the day, the end result was an IG inspection or an IG complaint wouldn't have done much because he was transitioning out of the military at 14 years. Any potential legal action was going to be limited because it's so hard to prove the intent behind these things. And he is smart enough to know that. He is smart enough to know like, oh, I could easily explain my way out of why I did this or why I did that. But he knew sending me to Japan was going to derail the immigration process and affect any, follow-on deployments with SOCOM, things like that. Going to a Raider battalion would have been great for the career, would have been a great experience. I felt that I was at that level without a doubt. And I was robbed of that opportunity. And I just got really angry. So going back, though, to that deployment where all of that transpired, there were some pretty awesome things that did happen on that deployment as a medic for me. I can appreciate the strategic impact of a MU in a certain location, but if you were to like zoom in and look at the actual day-to-day grind of, let's say, a Recon Marine or a Recon Corpsman on a MU, it's pretty mind-numbing. And so having done a MU in the past, I knew that I had to keep myself gainfully employed. And so as an IDC or independent duty corpsman, Recon IDC, I am seeing patients every day. And on that deployment, I had seen a little over 800 patients. So I see them, I create a treatment plan, order diagnostics, and there are a few significant patients that stand out to me that I think are just cool experiences. So one young Marine was outside of my office. We just closed medical, basically. And I was going back into my office to continue documenting, finish up my notes for the day. And this corporal is just looking all sad outside of my office. And he's like, I have really bad pain right here. And I was like, okay. And we're in the middle of the ocean at this point. We're between like Guam and Asia. And so immediately I was like, oh, this could be appendicitis. So take him inside, and physical exam's a home run. Like, this guy's got appendicitis without a doubt. And I go to the surgeon. I was like, hey, this guy's got clear physical exam findings that demonstrate appendicitis. And he's like, okay. Comes in, does his own physical exam. And while we were doing that, we had drawn blood work. And the surgeon's like, what do you want to do? And I was like, surgery. And he's like, well, I appreciate that, but we're not there yet. And he's like, his blood work doesn't show that he's got appendicitis. He's like, let's follow up with him in a couple hours. So I was like, all right. Send the kid away, and I was like, do not eat lunch. I was like, we're doing surgery today. So he comes back a couple hours later, I draw his blood, and I smear it under basically a microscope slide, and I'm looking at it under the microscope, and I'm seeing a left shift, which is basically your blood is telling me that there is an acute process and bleeding occurring somewhere in your body. So I go to the surgeon. I was like, hey, I just manually counted a left shift. I was like, can we do surgery? And he's like, what do you mean you manually counted a left shift? And I was like, well, I drew his blood and counted it under the microscope. And he was like, yeah, okay. He's like, yeah, let's do surgery. So I'm the #1 assist for that laparoscopic appendectomy. The CRNA, who is the nurse anesthetist, was like, hey, Rory, he's like, do you want to intubate? So I was like, yep. So I intubated, which is basically the breathing tube in the throat. I leave the room, I scrub in, I come back, and now I'm the #1 assist helping him patch this guy up and remove the appendicitis. So while we're in there in the OR, we get a call about a medevac patient that needs surgery right now. He's got a really bad infection in his spine or in the skin that is making its way to the spine. So the surgeon looks at me and he's like, do you want to do another surgery? So we basically get that patient into recovery with the appendicitis, and then we bring in the new guy, run him through a quick debridement, get out some of this dead tissue, and get him in recovery. And I go back to the berthing with all my guys, and they're like, oh, nice you to show up, Rory. Like, where you been all day? And I was like, oh, I just did 2 surgeries. And I said it so casually that they didn't really believe me. They were like, yeah, all right, whatever, dude. But then they heard through the chains, it came down through the chain of command, and they're like, hey, Farrell was in there doing surgery with the surgeon. Great job all around. So that was really cool. Another big event on deployment, big event for a medic, I would say. I'm in the office, it's after hours, it's probably 4 or 5, and I'm not seeing patients anymore. I'm finishing up some notes, doing admin. And another E6 corpsman comes in, a regular corpsman comes in, and he's got a young patient with him. And he's like, hey, Rory, do you mind if I just use your room to do an exam real quick? I was like, sure. So I'm like typing on the computer, and I'm listening, I'm keeping one ear open, and this corporal is complaining about really deep pain in his armpit. And so immediately I'm like looking at him, and I could see his left bicep vein was bulging. And I went up to the corpsman doing the exam, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna take it from here. Something was making the hair on my neck stand up, and I was like, something bad's going on here. So I took over the assessment, and I finished my physical exam, and I am almost positive I know what's going on, but it's not really possible, I would say. Like, making this diagnosis where we currently are with this young patient is like winning the lottery. And I call in a surgeon. It was a different surgeon. They had transitioned. So I'm talking to a neurosurgeon. I was like, hey, just hear me out. I was like, I think this guy's got an upper extremity DVT, which is a deep vein thrombosis. It's essentially a clot, and it's based on how he was presenting it seemed pretty large. And so just so happened we were a few days out from Okinawa, Japan, so I can order some of these diagnostics and get this guy screened. So last minute request to get a CT scan and an ultrasound. And the guy, the medical officer that orders these exams, he's like, just some like new O3. And he's like giving me a hard time about it. He's like, hey, he's like, these requests have to be in like 72 hours prior. And I'm like, well, I just saw the guy. And he's like, well, what would you do if we weren't going to Japan? And I was like, I'd fucking medevac him. And I was like, order it or go talk to the surgeon. So we end up ordering it. And while we're pulling into port, a couple of the other medical officers that I was friends with and that were pretty much mentors to me clinically saw the reason for the CT exam, and they're talking to me and they're like, so what do you think he's got? And I was like, I think he's got an upper extremity DVT. And they kind of scoffed. They're like, no way, man. They're like, there's no possible way he's got that. And I was like, all right, whatever. This is what I think it is. And so several days later, the exam results come back, and one of the doctors comes up to me and he pulls me into his office, and we're like chest to chest. And he's like, you were fucking right. He's like, you were fucking right. And it was like this massive clot in his upper extremity that at any point, for any reason, whether in the gym, doing manual labor, could have moved and killed him. And so it was a big deal. He was medevaced, but that was a huge success. Like, that dude could have died in his rack because of that. And it was just one of those things where I was like, wow, this is like awesome. That's why I love medicine. And I shudder to think what would have happened if I wasn't paying attention and if I just let it ride, or if I was just being lazy. It was like, I don't fucking care. I'm not going to pay attention, which happens quite a bit. That deployment was particularly challenging for a lot of reasons. Overall, it was successful. Those encounters are what absolutely made it successful. I always develop really good rapport with my patients, and I legitimately do care. One particular incident was I was treating a patient for headaches, a female. She had come in to see me several times. I was treating her for headaches and developed a good rapport. She felt comfortable coming to me. That was early in the deployment. About halfway through, she comes to me and she's like, walks straight into my office, and she's like, I'm going to kill so-and-so after lunch. And there was like no sign of this being like a joke. And all of us have, a healthy bit of, probably an unhealthy bit of cynicism where it's like, okay, come on. I didn't say that. I took her seriously, and I was like, okay, how are you going to do it? And this person went on to describe that she was the only forklift driver. They were due to move equipment in the well deck, and she was going to kill him with the forklift. No kidding in her voice at all. Like, dead serious. So I was like, I believe you. And I was like, can I get somebody in here so I can go talk with another doctor really quick? And she was like, yep. So put an escort in the room, or somebody just to stay with her, and then go to the psychologist. And I was like, hey, I need to bring in an urgent case right now. Walk the patient in, and crisis averted. But I went and talked to the psychologist after, and I was like, do you think that was like a legitimate case of like homicidal ideations? And he was like, without a doubt, that probably would have ended badly. So I would attribute the fact that that patient felt comfortable coming to me and confiding in me, being like, hey, that was the cry for help. That was like, hey, take me seriously. Again, what if I was just like, get out of here? Who knows what would have happened? I knew through previous encounters that the work environment she was in was not healthy for her, and she was the only female. I can certainly see why she felt the way she did. It's not my job to take sides. It's my job to treat the patient. And I was like, yeah, from your perspective, I can completely understand this, and you are probably validated in how you feel. And it culminated in that. So it was pretty wild. finished that deployment. A lot of stuff happened with COVID. I ended up having surgery on my foot. I was walking around on a broken foot for a year and a half, needed surgery on that. COVID happened, execute orders to Japan with my spouse. We get to Japan, we check into 3rd Recon, and sure enough, I am now again working for an E7 who doesn't have it together. Come to find out, he was sent there as a place to basically end his career. Again, put him in a closet, send him out there. Butted heads with him quite a bit. And, you know, again, this isn't meant to be disparaging, but it is a matter of fact. He left the command and was mandated to go into inpatient alcohol abuse treatment. And so through that basically 2.5 years that we worked together, I was dealing with that. And to give you an idea, the last 3 E7s that I dealt with, one was the malicious actor, the bad actor. Another one who I'm very good friends with now, he also had substance abuse issues, left that command due to those issues. So 1st Recon was basically summed up by those 2 people influencing my career. Didn't go well. Check into 3rd Recon, again, this is who I have to deal with. And now we are so far removed from people that can potentially have an impact on my career and my junior guys' careers. And now we are left with this guy. So that was really challenging. Okinawa is a really great place to be, period. 3rd Recon Battalion, I am immensely proud to have served in Okinawa and at 3rd Recon. The work that they are doing, although it's no longer my mission, I still feel like drawn to what they're doing. Their mission is so impactful, and it is really challenging to be out there, you know, especially for the young recondos and the young recon corpsmen. Living in the barracks, being in a different time zone complicates everything. Getting back to the United States is a production. It's incredibly expensive. And so you truly do feel like you're out there alone and unafraid with your guys. But the work being done and the training tempo out there is second to no unit in the military. They are constantly working. And I feel like this would be an appropriate point to just share my opinion about how incredible the reconnaissance community is. And I owe that to them for how well they treated me, you know, the last 10 to 12 years of my career. Reconnaissance Marines are absolutely at an elite level. And although they do not have that SOCOM credentialing, so to speak, they're not tasked by SOCOM, they're absolutely working in an elite capacity. And to give you an idea, a reconnaissance Marine, entry-level reconnaissance Marine hitting the fleet, Marine Corps boot camp, 3 months, high intensity. Immediately go to ITB, formerly SOI or the School of Infantry, another grueling course, another 3 months. Then they go to the basic reconnaissance course. So their first 9 months is all high intensity training. Just for them to get through that is quite an accomplishment. Then they go to airborne, military free fall, the Marine Combatant Dive Course, SEER, and then they check in, and then they're immediately like, hey, you're going to this platoon, and now you need to go to SEER, or I'm sorry, you need to go to breacher, maybe sniper, maybe comm, you know, something like that. And at 2 years in, they can run a team and go and do long-range reconnaissance, urban reconnaissance. I mean, truly impressive, truly impressive. And, you know, I feel like a lot of them oftentimes feel like they're not operating at that elite level because they're not a part of SOCOM, but it's simply not true. I mean, if you have the opportunity to work with a reconnaissance team or a reconnaissance company, all they need is an opportunity. They are just incredibly hard workers and incredibly professional. Contrary to their age, they are incredibly capable, and they're mature. And I would argue that there is a degree of maturity and professionalism in those young reconnaissance Marines that you don't find in other organizations because of the senior enlisted presence. Like the senior enlisted, you know, were coming out of the GWAT, but most of those dudes fought in the initial invasion or in those high op tempo periods in the GWAT, and they will not let those young Marines ruin the reputation or compromise the reputation of the reconnaissance community. So, and most of those are my friends, my good buddies. I don't want to sit here and say like, woe is me. I'm sure my approach to certain problems with senior enlisted probably could have been more tactful, but I wouldn't have needed to be that way if that leadership presence was there. And I don't know why. All I can say is that I was a top performer everywhere I went. Objectively, on paper, I was meeting the mission. I was saving lives. I was a subject matter expert, and I was leading young reconnaissance corpsmen and young recon Marines. And I really felt that was worth it. And it's really disheartening when you take a look around the fleet and I see people that don't have the level of expertise, don't have the deployment experience, and are just not subject matter experts get promoted, and they don't look great in uniform. I mean, that's my polite way of saying they just don't look. If you were to look at them, you'd be like, there's no way you're in the military, So that was disappointing. I don't know why I wasn't promoted. I would certainly attribute some of those experiences, or those experiences contributed to the lack of promotion, but it is what it is. I would say the transition was exciting. Some unique challenges, retiring from overseas, for sure. I don't recommend that at all for several reasons, but I wasn't going to stay in just to retire from a stateside location. So that aspect of it was challenging, transitioning from overseas into a retirement, not owning a home in the United States, and doing the deliberate planning to find a location that was suitable for a young family. That was pretty stressful. And so we ended up moving to Utah sight unseen, just looking at it on paper, saying like, hey, these statistics and demographics look pretty good for us. We ended up going to Utah, but in terms of the military transition, I think, as I've mentioned, I've been deconstructing that process for several years. What the DoD provides is woefully inadequate. Doesn't matter who you are, what rank you are. 3 days plus some other random 2-day courses is not enough for somebody to feel comfortable reintegrating. I don't think they're doing as much as they could in terms of creating solid programs, but also think there's a problem with the quality of the opportunity to transition well. And what I mean by that is you look across the military and different units, different organizations offer their service members different levels of opportunities. And so a young Marine in Okinawa may deploy in their last 8 months. And so when they come back, they've only got 2 to 3 months to facilitate a transition. Simply not enough time. And so knowing that, for me, I started my exit strategy years ago, and it was smooth, and I knew that I had to seize the initiative in the transition. I felt that I needed to hit the ground running as soon as I got out, whether it was my business, fitness, hobbies, and that gave me purpose. Being present for my wife and my son, trying to refocus on myself. My own health and fitness were relegated due to the op tempo of the job coming from Japan. And, now that I'm out, I can, start to pursue fitness again. I can start to pursue hobbies to a greater extent. And that has certainly given me a little bit more purpose. But overall, I'd say that the transition has gone well. I do think it's really hard for me to engage like normal people that haven't served in the military. I don't know why, but there's just not that connection. The only friend I've made is a former Marine, and which is great. But he's the only friend. I saw his tattoo at the pool, started bullshitting, and that connection has certainly made living in a new place a little bit better. Started a transition consulting business about 4 years ago in the wake of a conversation I had with one of my platoon sergeants. He was getting out and he was just having a lot of issues managing the transition. So I went home, created a plan for him, gave it to him, ended up transitioning well. And what I realized in that process was the model or the template that I created for him could be applied to anybody, any rank, any length of service. And so started doing deliberate transition planning for pretty much everybody, focused on recon Marines. But it ultimately, now it's every branch, every make of SOF. And the goal is to create a deliberate, step-by-step plan for somebody to get out of the military, whether it's an 06, an E4, everybody needs some type of deliberate path forward. So what I do is I create their priorities of work and their timelines associated with their transition, and through a series of email reminders, text message reminders, one-on-one consultations, I manage the process of them getting out of the military. Sometimes people want to focus more on employment opportunities. Sometimes people are like, hey, I have a ton of undocumented injuries. How do I approach that? Both of those are massively important, but I think what I gravitate to and what I would say I'm a specialist in is helping people with undocumented conditions navigate the DoD medical system and get the appropriate treatment. That's a huge issue for people when they get out. And a question I get all the time, and if you peruse any veteran forum, you'll see this, is, if somebody's focused on the VA claim, they are too narrowly focused. They need to focus on getting in and getting treatment for conditions. It's not about a VA claim. It is about getting yourself treated for the legitimate conditions that you have. And what is so alarming is that a lot of these conditions are so insidious that people don't even recognize the symptoms of them while they're happening. And it's this slow deterioration of your body and your mental health. And then you stop and look in the mirror and you're like, who is that? And that's happened to me. That's happened to the majority of my clients. And when it comes to different medical conditions, it's not just, oh, I fucked up my knee on a jump last year. My questions are, where have you been deployed to? What chemicals have you been exposed to? What are the environmental hazards you've been exposed to? Those are important because those factors do directly contribute to some of these conditions that don't pop up for 10 years. And so it's a shift in mindset for a lot of clients when it's like, well, I'm not necessarily worried about all of these obvious things. I'm worried about less obvious things, becoming socially withdrawn, which I have, having chronic headaches, which I have. And people, we just normalize everything. I think in the military, you relegate your health to a secondary priority or maybe even a tertiary priority. And then you're like, oh, damn, I am actually pretty messed up. And the reason that is so important is because I do think there is a direct connection between a lot of those conditions and suicide, or just a deterioration in mental and physical health in general. And I can go, I could put us all to sleep by talking about those things, but zeronexus.com, we're on Instagram. You can email me directly at rory@zeronexus.com. Anybody that is 2 years out or less should start the deliberate planning process now. I cannot overstate the importance of it. These statistics are readily available, but a third of transitioning service members are in the highest risk category, meaning they don't have sufficient financial resources or friends or support networks outside the military. And what is alarming when I read that, what is alarming to me is that, the DoD does not recruit from private schools. They typically go into areas like mine, maybe broken homes, maybe people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. And let's say those individuals do 4 years or 6 years, and they're like, hey, I'm done, don't want to do anymore. Unless they have a deliberate plan, they are likely to fall back into the same pattern that caused them to join the military in the first place, or fall victim to the same socioeconomic circumstances that led them to join in the first place. And so a deliberate planning process can prevent that. 3 days in a transition assistance course is simply not enough. When you do the deliberate planning, it completely mitigates the risk of suicide for a number of reasons. So, I think if we're trying to crack the nut on suicide or impact it, I do think deliberate planning is a part of that equation, in addition to proper mental health resources. And, what ultimately put us in contact was a post I had made that one of my recondos and clients had took interest in. But, I had a couple friends commit suicide in the last month. And these guys, for all intents and purposes, were unkillable in combat. And most of which had families. And I think about, in that moment, what drove them to do that? What emotion was so powerful that they felt that, they were better off leaving their family, that they couldn't deal with it. And I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, this broad stroke solution is going to apply it. I think we would do all of our friends that have committed suicide a disservice if we said, we just have to fix this. There is no simple solution. And I do think that every situation is unique and it requires time and attention. There is no broad stroke solution. And I would be a fool to sit up here and say, well, just do these things, when there are countless mental health professionals, social workers, and counselors out there that have dedicated their life to solving this problem. But I do think my input would simply be that every case is unique. Every single person is unique. And the same thing that draws us into service, the same characteristics and the same mindset that make us successful in the military, are likely a contributing factor as to why most of us won't reach out to resources. We are like, nope, I don't need the help. I can grin and bear it. And then ultimately you reach an impasse and, the emotions are too great. Learn from my mistakes. If you run into, a leadership issue, do the right thing. I did not do the right thing. I think it was, my decision was more ego based and I felt that I could handle it. Retrospectively, that was the wrong decision. For people transitioning, whether you work with me or another company or just your spouse or your team, create a deliberate plan and start early. Do not wait to make a decision. Even if you're on the fence about re-enlisting or transitioning, create a plan. At least give yourself the option. Additionally, for those who have already transitioned, get involved with your community. Don't be afraid to have some internal dialogue and ask, hey, I'm not talking to as many people as I should be, or, I haven't called my family in a while. A little bit of introspection goes a long way. Discipline, without a doubt. Do your best to seize the initiative, whether that's engaging in hobbies, educational pursuits. Get engaged and seize the initiative. Do not give yourself the opportunity to sit on the couch and fall into that pattern of poor behavior. And if you need help, reach out. I can't say this enough. No agency or organization is going to offer us what we are going to offer each other. A phone call and text message goes a long way.